his statutes on religious freedom. The second was the author of the Declaration of Independence. And the third was founder of the University of Virginia. He left off president because this might be really relevant to our speaker tonight. He found politics terribly distasteful, and he was abused and maligned when he was president. And he wrote very often about how it was the worst thing that he ever went through. So he didn't have it listed on his tombstone. But also, when I arrived at graduate school at the ripe old age of 21, and I walked into a building, and the first thing I saw in the building was this quote, which I'm going to read just for the sake of the students, this being the first Thomas Jefferson Lecture on Freedom. And it's referring to the University of Virginia. He said, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left free to combat it." I never forgot that quote for my entire graduate career, my entire life, because in many ways I see the foundation of the Freedom Project and of intellectual life in general of allowing reason to occupy the space of the intellect, and therefore to do battle with unreason, and to advance us forward. So I'd like to introduce Professor Ignatieff, who really doesn't need any more introduction than, because he's so prominent, but the last time I saw him, he was at Harvard. It was in a seminar when we were discussing, a number of professors in the area, discussing the Iraq War and human rights, and he said, I'm actually Canadian, I'm headed back to run for the Parliament, and he did that. He served in the Parliament of Canada and was the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, but has also, throughout his life, blended intellectual life and politics in a very unique way. And I'd like to welcome him and thank him for coming, and I'm sorry I went on so long. I promised I wouldn't, but I couldn't help it. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Susanna's here, my wife, so that's important to you because she's quality control. She does what good wives do, which is when you go on too long, she goes that, so you know you got to stop. I want to thank Tom for a warm introduction and thank him for his friendship over many years. I'm looking down at some PowerPoint slides. My wife also believes that power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So we're not going to do the slides. I'm going to spare you that. I'm going to talk to them, but not inflict them. My subject is called, my title is Liberty Divisible? Capitalism and Authoritarianism in the 21st Century. And what I wanted to start with is go back to 1989, before many of you were born, and just think about the illusions that we had when the wall came down and the communist system collapsed. If you lived through that era, it was hard not to be euphoric. The world had been divided in two, a communist system, a capitalist system, and now there was, it seemed, one world. It seemed to us also that the communist economic system had proven its bankruptcy, and had it also proven the bankruptcy of its political system. And so henceforward, we were going to be in one world. And we made a crucial assumption that I want to kind of identify, which is in this one world, we'd all be in one kind of economic system. We'd all be in one political system, and the two systems would reinforce each other. That is, this is the point, liberty would be indivisible. Economic liberty would promote political liberty would defend economic liberty, and the two were necessarily twined. So liberty was indivisible in our vision of what would happen. And in fact, what's happened has been very different. This is really interesting. Another example of how euphoria and euphoric dreams are succeeded by chill reality. And chill reality has seen the emergence of a new kind of regime that provides economic freedom without public freedom, that separates capitalist market economics from democratic freedom. And so you have regimes that are capitalist in economics, authoritarian in politics, and nationalist in ideology. And they are now the chief regime challengers to liberal democracy around the world. And we didn't expect that to happen. And I want to think about these regimes with you. And I mean with you. I hope I'm not going to be talking at you all the time. I just want to get some thoughts out and then we have a discussion. So I'm looking at this new form of authoritarian capitalism that we didn't expect, a regime that combines authoritarian politics with market economics. There are a whole bunch of them, and I don't want to say they're all the same. There are pure authoritarian capitalist systems that do not have free elections. They have political imprisonment, and they have a substantial amount of media censorship. Some of you are from that regime, or come from that country. China would be one example. There are other kinds of regimes in which you have what could be called competitive authoritarianism. If the first type is authoritarian capitalism, the second type is competitive authoritarian capitalism, and that would be somewhere like Russia, where you have elections. Putin has elections. The political legitimacy proceeds from elections, but they're not run on a level playing field, and the ruling party always wins. The third type of authoritarian regime, and I'm not going to talk about this as much, but I do this because my wife is Hungarian, and Hungary is an interesting example of a third type of authoritarian regime, illiberal democracy. That is, these are regimes where you have elections, you have capitalist market economics, but you have single-party dominance at the same time. You have free elections, you have free media, but you have gerrymandered constitutional orders which guarantee that someone like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has set up, rigged the electoral system so that he will be in control for a very long time. Another example of that is Turkey. Turkey is like that. Turkey has democratic rule, but the system is gerrymandered to give Erdogan a permanent majority, and beneath it all, a capitalist system. So, three kinds of authoritarian regime: authoritarian capitalism, competitive authoritarian capitalism, and what I'm calling illiberal democracy. And I want to focus on some of the particularities of these regimes. And I want to ask, first of all, kind of, why did it happen? Why didn't we get a liberal democratic transition or a democratic transition elsewhere? And I think what we didn't realize, and by we I mean, liberal Democrats in the West, we didn't realize, let's take Russia, how enduring the deep state would be. By deep state I mean the security apparatus. The house burns down, capitalism collapses, and kind of in the basement is Vladimir Putin, right? In the basement is the KGB, or what is now called the FSB. The deep state survives the collapse of the regime and is in fact the only instrument of the Soviet system that survives, like something in the basement. And that's the basis. It's from those cadres in the basement that you get the new regime. Putin is a FSB, KGB guy, and the people around him are FSB, KGB guys, and they hold on to power through the transition. The thing that's really interesting about these deep state people, and this is, I think, a key point, is that they realize capitalism could be really good for them. That is, if in the 90s you have a sell-off of state assets, a privatization of state assets in the ruin of the Soviet Empire, the deep state people realize we can snap this up really cheap. And so they begin to take over key positions that in what were formerly state-owned enterprises. And so you get the deep state buying up the economic assets of the former Soviet system. And thanks to privatization, this is the point, open markets actually help the deep state transform itself into what could be called a kind of state capitalist kleptocracy. By kleptocracy, I mean the rule of the thieves, right? And so that's a kind of basic story. You have regime collapse, security services survive, they then privatize the economy and realize that a capitalist market economy allows them to get rich, but it also, and this will be my next point, it creates an enormous new principle of legitimacy for the regime. And I want to explain that in a minute. Let's just note, I won't go on about this, that there's nothing inevitable about what happens here. Other communist regimes collapse in Eastern Europe and don't take this path. I just want to notice that Poland doesn't go this way. The Baltic states don't go this way. The Czechs don't go this way. I think because very quickly that part of Eastern Europe gets linked into the European project and gets linked into NATO, and these linkages pull them away from this kind of regime type. And so democracy does consolidate in these places, but not in China, Russia, and these illiberal democracies. One of the other things that's going on here, and I'm now talking particularly about Russia, is as the Soviet system collapses, it unleashes an enormous amount of popular fear. It's a frightening thing to have your world collapse. It's a frightening thing to see even a hated regime collapse. And what happens through the 90s is that that collapse creates many more losers than winners. It creates a widespread sense of insecurity and fear. And that produces a nostalgia for the order and security that has been lost in the Soviet period. I think in China, and I hope that our Chinese students and friends will correct me if I get anything wrong about your country, but my sense is that Tiananmen produces an enormous amount of anxiety among general Chinese population about the possibility that a democratic change will produce just disorder, will produce chaos, will produce fear. Tiananmen is a moment in which Chinese Democrats stand up, defy the tanks, and then are crushed. But I think for millions of Chinese, they looked at that and said, if that's what a transition looks like, we don't like it at all. It's just too scary, it's too frightening, it's too destabilizing. So these authoritarian regimes rediscover a principle of legitimacy based on the fear that is unleashed by transition. And the other thing that these societies, I think, discover as capitalism begins to sweep through China, sweep through Russia, sweep through Eastern Europe, sweep into Turkey, the spread of capitalism is also quite frightening and quite destabilizing. And so this re-legitimizes authoritarian rule. Give us free markets, but give us order. Seems to be what the public comes to feel through the 90s in Russia, in China, in parts of Eastern Europe. And these regimes not only provide order, but they also capitalize and exploit resentment and envy towards the West, which is where some of the nationalism begins to emerge. And authoritarians capture a kind of language of injured pride in the population. This is especially true in Russia. All of this is kind of background to, in a sense, my main point, which is that what these new regimes, I think, discover is that freedom is divisible. That is, in the new regimes that take shape in China, in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, and in some of these other places, is that citizens gain the private freedom to own, to accumulate, to transfer property, the freedom to exit, the freedom to return, the freedom to educate their children overseas. Those are the private freedoms they gain from capitalism, and those are hugely important. And in return, they forego public freedoms, the public right to voice, to participate, to associate, to hold citizens responsible. It's as if the regime says, we're going to split freedom in two, you're going to get one, and in return for getting one, you don't get the other. So freedom divides at this point, and the interesting thing to me about this is that this is a tremendously interesting source of re-legitimation for authoritarianism. Let me explain what I mean. Divisible freedom offers a kind of safety valve for the regime. So if capitalism gives you the freedom to accumulate, to hold property, to get a little apartment, to, transfer it to your children, the minute you have those property rights in an authoritarian regime, it gives you a massive stake in stability and order. It doesn't feed desire for more, it feeds a desire to hold on to what you've got. So freedom to accumulate gives the middle class a stake in the prevailing authoritarian order. Freedom to travel, which is a crucial freedom after 1989, allows the restless, the discontented, or the unemployed to simply escape. I mean, we forget what I'm working off is the contrast with the totalitarian regimes between 45 and 89, where you couldn't travel at all. These regimes allow the safety valve. If anybody who doesn't like it just leaves. And that's a better way to maintain authoritarian systems than trying to keep people shut up at home. The freedom to learn abroad is a huge freedom. It means that there's some people in this room who 30 years ago you wouldn't be here. And it's fantastic that you're here. But it helps the regime in two ways. If you're really fed up with China, you can probably stay here. Alternatively, if you want to go back to China, you're having a world-class education. And that's helpful to help China's bureaucracy and power system grow and develop. And you have a place in that system. And I'm not, believe me, I'm not mocking it. I'm just trying to point out the ways the freedom to learn is a tremendously stabilizing principle of these regimes. I think the other thing that's very interesting about these regimes is the relative freedom of access to the internet. Everybody talks about the Great Wall of China firewall and all the restrictions, but in fact, the internet, there are 450, 500, 600 million Chinese who have access to the internet, and that relative new freedom to communicate, again, acts as a safety valve. A safety valve on the one hand. The other thing that's very clear is the regime watches the internet very closely, and it gives the regime eyes into what people are thinking in a way that the previous totalitarian regimes didn't have. So, in a sense, the limited private freedom that's made possible by insertion into a global capitalist economy, actually helps to undergird and support and sustain authoritarian regimes. Another way to put this is there's a thing in political science called the dictator's dilemma. The dictator has a dilemma in the sense that he's got to have total control of everything or he loses control of everything very quickly. A dictator has to know everything that's going on in a society. That's the principle by which a dictator maintains control. These are not dictatorial regimes. These are regimes where there's relatively small amounts of political imprisonment. There are systemic human rights violations, but it's not the Gulag, right? And the loosening of controls actually gives an authoritarian regime much more capacity to figure out what the population is thinking. The internet has limited amounts of freedom, and then they put in lots of people to watch it. And that way, the dictator is no longer blind. The dictator can see. He can see what the public is thinking. The internet gives authoritarian regimes eyes and ears. One of the interesting little examples, if you allow a little sidebar in this, because this is, I'm trying to specify what's unique and new about these regimes. I find it fascinating. I read a book recently about the spread of commercialized media in China. There's state media, state newspapers, state radio, state television, and then there's these private commercial networks, private newspapers, and they're much more successful than the state form. They're the ones that people want to read and watch. It's the commercial stuff. The interesting thing that a political scientist discovered is that when the regime in China wants to get a message through, it uses commercialized media, not the state media, because the commercialized media is more credible than the state media. You see how intricate this is? Because there's a little bit of separation between commercialized media and the regime, when a message from the regime passes through commercial media, it appears more credible. And you begin to see how these regimes are manufacturing and reducing their authority. And the other point about relative openness, this goes back to the dictator's dilemma thing. One of the problems for a dictator is that if you have to maintain total control, then you're tremendously dependent on your security apparatus. You have to believe everything that your security chief is telling you. What if your security chief is lying to you? So a dictator lives in a state of permanent paranoia. In the relative freedom that has opened up in these societies since the 1990s, that's not Putin's problem. It's not Xi Jinping's problem. He's got thousands of ways of figuring out what the people are thinking. And it allows him to be a much more flexible, much more reactive, much more responsive authoritarian than Brezhnev or Mao or the previous regimes. And so what I guess I'm saying is we are seeing something new emerge in our account of authoritarianism in the 21st century. These guys are onto something new, and it's kind of exciting, kind of interesting. And there's another feature of it that I want to focus on, and that's the use of the law. Think about the law in these regimes. And one of the ways to think about the law in these regimes is to set up a contrast familiar to some of you, I think, between rule of law and rule by law. It's a very important distinction. In rule of law, you have an independent judiciary, you have open courts, you have constitutional appeal, and above all, you have the institutional independence, political independence, of the legal authorities of a state. That separation, that independence, is what gives you rule of law. Rule of law is actually a regime threat to authoritarian systems. Because the minute you have judicial review of political decisions, the minute you have a court with the capacity to overturn a political decision, you're not in an authoritarian regime. You're not in a regime where authoritarianism is stable and in control. You're in a regime of separation of powers. The minute you're in a regime of separation of powers, you're out of a straight authoritarian system. So it's a regime challenge if you have rule of law. But capitalism requires some degree of predictability, by which I mean nothing more fancy than the deals must stick. If you're going to open your country to capitalist economic development, as China has done since the 1980s, you've got to have some legal form that allows for stability and enforcement of contract. And so one of the things that China, I think, teaches us, and also Russia teaches us, is capitalism emphatically does not need rule of law. But what it does need is rule by law. That is, rule by law is administrative predictability, commercial predictability, bureaucratic predictability, contracts that stick. And the Chinese have developed a whole new form of administrative law, socialist legality as they call it, that does generate sufficient stability for a capitalist to invest there, for people to be relatively secure about their property. So rule by law manages the neat trick of providing the stability necessary for capitalist growth without the rule of law challenge that would come if you had an independent judiciary. And this seems to me really interesting, very, very different than anything you saw in the Soviet or pre-1989 period in China. So that contrast between rule of law and rule by law is extremely important, because it then means that the regime has sufficient control that it can enforce rule by law, and that means that it has control over one of the unstable elements of capitalism, which is that capitalism creates power. Capitalism creates wealthy people. Wealthy people want to use their power politically. If you have a rule of law system, and a guy makes $1 billion or a woman makes $1 billion, rule of law guarantees the security of that investment from political seizure. That's the point of rule of law. If you have rule by law, Putin can take it away from you at 9 o'clock in the morning. So these oligarchs who've made huge money out of the 90s live in a rule by law system in which their assets are essentially survive at the mercy of Putin. Same in Xi Jinping's regime. Any regime challenge that would come from a Chinese billionaire can be cut off at the pass through rule by law. If it was rule of law, they'd have an independent right of appeal. So this system, rule by law, allows an authoritarian regime to deal with one of the destabilizing effects of capitalist rule, which is it creates a lot of rich people. And rich people seek power. And an authoritarian regime has to keep that from getting out of control. And let me give you just the flavor of this, because it's kind of funny, a little comic interlude, so you can see what this feels like if you're a Vladimir Putin. Putin had a wonderful quote in the New York Times just before Christmas 2014, in which he said this, quote, "A chicken can exercise ownership of eggs, and it can get fed while it's sitting on the eggs. But a chicken knows it's not really their eggs." Now think about what he's saying to you here. He's saying a capitalist may sit on eggs and hatch some nice little eggs, but I own the hen house, and they're my eggs, right? This is, I'm trying to get you into what rule by law actually translates to. The eggs are mine. That's what he's saying. And so you have a legal regime that's particularly vivid in Russia, but it's also apparent in China, in which the phrase that you hear in Russia is, "For my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law." That is, you use the law as an instrument to dispossess any regime challenger. That's why Khodorkovsky did, 10 years in jail. Soon as you become a billionaire and then enter politics, look out, your assets will be taken from you. So you have legal expropriation of regime challengers. You have legal monopoly and price fixing. And then what happens, and this is also, the oligarchs manage this problem by basically offshoring any private capital they can. So, the Russian oligarchs are in London not because London is a lovely, sophisticated capital. They are in London because their assets cannot be seized in a rule of law society. The oligarchs understand exactly why you want to have the capacity to offshore assets, because they're protected, because they're safe from seizure by Putin. And this is a a dynamic of the 21st century we need to look at. What I'm leading to is when you ask yourself, what is the... So far I've presented a picture in which authoritarian capitalism is managing to use the limited private freedoms of capitalism to sustain authoritarianism long term. That seems like a stable marriage, particularly if it's ruled by law authoritarianism. What's the challenge? What's the instability? The instability, the source of instability in this regime is corruption. That is, the whole regime is basically a form of systemic corruption. You use rule by law to guarantee the outcomes of capitalist competition in these systems. And as a consequence, the corruption becomes systemic both in Russia and in China. And Xi Jinping took power and realized that corruption was a regime threat. Not just a problem, but something that could produce the kind of discontent and fury that could actually destabilize an authoritarian system. So he's been making war on corruption, but making war on corruption means making war on the party. It's very difficult to make war on corruption without making war on your own people. And so you initiate the war because corruption is a regime threat. You make war on the party, that becomes destabilizing. So let's not assume these regimes have resolved all their contradictions. There's a central one. Let me move on. I've talked about rule of law, rule by law. I've talked about the divisibility of freedom. Let me talk just very briefly about nationalism as a legitimation strategy.
Behind you.
Oh, it's there.
Sorry. You can have
Where
two.
is it?
Behind you.
Oh, there. Great. Comic interlude. Where's the water? The third pillar of this legitimation strategy for authoritarian capitalism is nationalism. In China, it's Confucianism, the rejection of universal values. In Russia, it's the revival of all this old Orthodox homeland stuff. I can afford to be scathing about the Orthodox stuff because I come from a Russian Orthodox family. So if I express contempt and skepticism for the slavish way in which the Orthodox Church has aligned itself to authoritarian power since forever, I got the right to say so. So if I'm dissing religion in this politically correct campus, I've got the right to do so. All right. But there's no question the church is just lined up behind him in ways that would have made the Tsar proud. And so you have nationalism as a legitimation strategy. You have it also in Hungary and Turkey. I won't go into those details. But nationalism is a very, very problematic source of legitimation because it alienates neighbors and poses a threat to the peace and order of the world. And we've seen the outcomes in the annexation of the Crimea, the frozen conflicts that have now been put in place, not just in eastern Ukraine, but in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Georgia, in Moldova. The Russian strategy in the near abroad is to make full and successful democratic transitions in the immediate neighborhood impossible by stirring up Russian ethnicity or Russian minorities in these areas, and then supporting them sufficiently to make it impossible for these societies like Georgia to consolidate as democracies and move to the West. In China, there has been a notable transition from the language of the soft rise to the language of the China dream, a much more potentially expansionist vision of China's place in the world. And a transition from thinking of itself as a peaceful regional hegemon to a superpower. The minute you take a kind of culturally driven Confucian cultural superiority as your legitimating principle, you're then committed to a certain kind of foreign policy which will give your neighbors some difficulties. But then the question, this is why these regimes are interesting. If you then ask the question, they're nationalists, but are they spoilers? Have they come into the international arena to tip the international order over? It's interesting. In some places, yes. In Ukraine, obviously. But look at the ways in which both Russia and China, as authoritarian capitalist regimes, remain within the global order. Russia is a member of the OSCE. Astonishingly, Russia observes the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, you'd think an authoritarian capitalist regime would pull out of transnational human rights invigilation. But this is interesting. They have rulings, they have 18,000 petitions coming into the European Court of Human Rights from Russian petitioners every year. Most of them are guys banged up in jail. And they're protesting about the stuff that prisoners protest about, which is that you didn't give me any food, and there are bars everywhere, and I'm being degraded and treated like an animal. And they often are. And the European Court hears these cases. And about once or twice a year, the Russian government loses one of these cases. If you're a total spoiler in the international system, you pull out of supranational human rights invigilation. In fact, they're still inside the tent. They still stump up their dues every year. So yes, nationalists, yes, revanchists, yes, destabilizing their immediate neighborhood, but at the same time, they're members of the international order. They're on the Security Council, they're in the European Court, and just notice in the last 2 weeks, Russia has been crucial to the Iranian nuclear deal. They're part of the P5+1. If you're a spoiler in the international system, you don't want to you don't want to make life easier for the Americans. You don't want to help Obama. But there is Lavrov helping, facilitating, not torpedoing the Iranian nuclear deal. China the same. Very expansionist and aggressive in its immediate neighborhood, but it's in the UN human rights system. It's in the world, it's in the WTO. So we're not looking at totalitarian systems who've come to break up the international order. We're not looking at spoilers. We're looking at people who are sometimes, as in the case of China, free riders on the international system. In the Russian case, we're sometimes looking at a country which is prepared to facilitate the maintenance of global order. So I make this point because it would be very easy to come out of this talk and think authoritarian capitalists, a challenge to liberal democracy, therefore our enemies. And I'm saying it's actually much more complicated and interesting than that. They're adversaries. Sometimes they're spoilers, but very often they are contributing to global order. And so our response to them should take care not to turn them from adversaries into enemies. Right? We've got to get this right by understanding the complexity of their role. Are they vulnerable? I've said that they've come up with, it seems to me, a really interesting symbiosis of the private freedom of capitalism with the public unfreedom of authoritarianism, and that this is a much more stable balance than we suppose. The regime threat I've identified is corruption. The other possibility is that growth will stop. The other thing that may stop this, as long as the bicycle is moving, these regimes are okay. What happens when a middle class stops increasing in size and stops increasing in GDP? At which point will they become angry, frustrated, impatient with their lack of public freedom? Because when your economy isn't growing, you're looking for collective solutions. And if collective solutions are precluded for you, that may produce regime challenge. The other aspect of this story, again, which makes it so different from the Cold War, is they trade their commodities on a global market. They are susceptible to all kinds of leverage effects. I was teaching my class today about the SWIFT system. Given what Russia is doing in Ukraine, should we toss these Russians out of the SWIFT interbank system? Every time you transfer money across a border, you go through SWIFT. One of the things we could do to really tighten the screws on the Russians is throw them out of SWIFT. Think about it. That would have huge leverage effects on them, but it would have substantial blowbacks for us. It would essentially weaponize the global financial system. It would take a global utility, which is the SWIFT system, and turn it into a weapon to use against the Russians. Not a smart idea, actually. So they are very vulnerable to international global pressures in a way that the Soviet systems and Mao's China was not. But equally, our interdependence has negative consequences for us. So that interdependence, I think, limits how we react to them. Let me now turn. I've gone on a little longer than I intended. My wife is beginning to do that. Come to the end, brother. Let me flip this around. I've talked about how vulnerable they are. What are our vulnerabilities? Let's look at us for a minute. I think you can say that our societies are premised, to a degree that I think we need to understand, our societies are premised on the indivisibility of freedom, on the deep interdependence of public and private freedom, political freedom and economic freedom. And we believe that as a normative commitment, but we also believe kind of sociologically that that makes us more resilient. It makes us more adaptive. It means that when economic systems are not working well for us, we can change them politically. When political systems are not working well, we can change them. That's what I mean by resilience. We also believe that indivisible societies, societies based on the indivisibility of freedom, are more innovative. Free media, international education, free capital markets encourage ideas and growth. The other thing we feel about indivisible societies based on the indivisibility of freedom, one of those freedoms is the freedom to come in and freedom to go out. Societies based on migration and free migration are much more dynamic than societies are not. So that's the good story we say about ourselves, but we have an accumulating set of vulnerabilities. And I think we're all very aware of them. We have corporate interests that have an effective veto power in our political system. We have entitlement capture, this would be the line from the right, entitlement capture, which creates ongoing fiscal pressure. We have a fiscal pressure which crowds out public investment in education and infrastructure. We have a dynamic culture of innovation which in fact exacerbates inequality, and it does so by increasing premia for skill and that then reduce demand for employment. What does that translate in? We've got an ongoing difficulty about employing our people and providing full employment. And we have a political system that is less and less responsive to public demands and needs. I talked earlier about the survival of the deep state in authoritarian regimes. We have a huge problem with the deep state in liberal democracies. The story of liberal democracy since 2000 has been the story of the steady deepening of the power and influence and reach and intrusiveness of our deep state. And we do not have effective control over the deep state, and that poses a real difficulty for liberty. The other thing, again, too obvious to mention, but worth mentioning when a crowd of young people are in the room, is that we have declining public participation in politics. In the last federal election in my country, in Canada, of the 18-year-olds eligible to vote in Canada in 2008 for the first time, only 1 in 5 bothered to turn out. That was an election I fought. We did our damnedest. Hey, wakey, wakey, you've got a democratic process. Don't you think you ought to take part? They all stayed home. I blame the kids, and then I blame the parents. But we have a problem here about democratic participation. We have a culture in which we have increasing, to use Galbraith's phrase, private affluence and public squalor, but more centrally to my purpose, a disconnection between private freedoms, which we experience on the internet, in our travel, in our education, in our private lives, and a public sphere that's increasingly alien to young people and to many others, a public freedom, a public sphere in which we do not feel it's worth participating, a public sphere that seems unresponsive to private demands. So I'm saying nothing less than one of our key vulnerabilities, if one of our strengths is the normative vision that liberty is indivisible, the sociological reality in 2014 is our liberty is very divisible. And when liberty is divisible, we have less and less economic freedom because we have more and more corporate control. And we have less and less public freedom because the public has walked away from a public sphere that doesn't appear to respond to public needs. So we've got, message is very simple. We've got to get our house in order. We've got to restore the indivisibility of freedom through political reform that reconnects citizens to their democracy, campaign finance laws, redistricting commissions. I mean, look, allow me, I can't resist. I'm a Canadian, I love this country, but the idea that the greatest democracy in the world would allow districting, the drawing of district boundaries to be in the hands of politicians is lunacy. There isn't a sensible liberal democracy in the world that would leave districting to politicians. It's the kind of thing that you can fix. You create impartial districting commissions that allow districts to change as population grows. Every country does it. Get with the program, United States. It's crazy. There isn't a sound liberal democracy that doesn't impose campaign finance limits. I could walk into a room as a political candidate next door in Canada and know that I could be in a room with millionaires and billionaires. They could only give me $1,500. You can't imagine how much that frees up your capacity to say what the hell you think. Really? I mean, Citizens United is a dagger pointed at the heart of your democracy. And what's ridiculous is there are 15 other liberal democracies that do a better job of keeping money under control. Money is not speech. Money is power. In any democracy understands you won't have a democracy at all unless you control the power of money. And I don't care what the First Amendment says. You've got to get this fixed. And this is said with the passion of someone who loves this country. This place has been wonderful to me. And I just hate to see what's going on here.
So do we.
Now, and look, I understand a Canadian giving Americans lectures about their democracy. You're not going to listen to Canada. I understand that. But listen to somebody. Listen to somebody before it's too late. Anyway, these are vulnerabilities, and I've told you exactly what to do about them. You're going to do it all, I know. Now, I really am coming to a conclusion. I just want to pick up the last point about which is the international challenge that authoritarian capitalism poses to the international order, and just repeat something that I said before. Let's remember the distinction between enemies and adversaries here. These are adversaries, and it is only politically prudent to make sure that we don't turn them into enemies. We do not want to return to an ideological battle between liberal democratic freedom and authoritarian capitalist freedom, and project into the future the language of the past. Let's remember a wonderful poem by a great writer called Constantine Cavafy, who had a wonderful poem called Waiting for the Barbarians, which some of you may know, which has this great line, "And now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians?" They were, those people, a kind of solution. Let's not make Russia and China a solution. One of the ways that liberal democracies in trouble solve their problems is to create an external enemy. Instead of dealing with the things we have to do at home, start projecting hostility outwards to systemic rivals. These are rivals. I don't want to underestimate the challenge they pose. But the smart thing is not to turn them into enemies, keep them adversaries, and fix what we have to fix at home. Thank you for your attention. I didn't go on too long. I'm looking at my watch. It wasn't too bad. And I've put enough hostages to fortune out there and said enough debatable, some downright wrong things for some of you to point them out. I hope you will. And I welcome any questions or comments or clarifications that you may have. Folks? Sir?
It sounded to me as if you made a persuasive case that freedom is simply, practically speaking, divisible. And as you were talking, it seemed to me that another piece of evidence that you could use, and I don't mean this as a very deep point, but just historically, functioning democracies are relatively new, and some version of capitalism along the lines you were describing is much, much older. So in that sense, it seems to me that history is also on the side that you seem to be leaning toward. And so I wonder, how strong is the case that, practically speaking, we can speak of liberty as indivisible in any way? And if there isn't a very strong case, how do we create the normative account that says that it is? What does that account look like?
That's a searching challenge to what I am saying, and I'm very grateful that you made it. My sense of the normative case for indivisibility is economic liberty, what I'm calling private liberty, is not secure without some institutions that publicly protect and guarantee property. It was my point about rule of law. The minute you have rule of law, any kind of rule of law implies a separation of powers. It implies some limit to public authority. So the indivisibility of liberty is based on the sense, which I think is both normatively true, but also has become descriptively true, unless you have rule of law guarantees and therefore limited government, property is not secure. At the most basic level, it's not secure. It's then fungible. An authoritarian can come along and rezone, an authoritarian can evict you, can expel you, whatever. That's, I think, the core insight. Is it a normative point exactly? It's, I think, an experiential point about the history of, if you ask, why is it that capitalism takes off in Europe and doesn't take off elsewhere? It has to do with the interdependence of stable division of power, rule of law regimes independent of political authority that guarantee the solidity of accumulation. It's a very that sounds pretty non-normative. It's just kind of how it happened, but it happened for a reason. And for that reason, That's, I think, why we believe in it. But you're right. This is not it's possibly not an internal verity. It's a contingent derivative of European history. And needless to say, not terribly persuasive to the Chinese as a result, right? Which might be your point. Yeah?
Actually, going off that, when you were talking about in authoritarian regimes that people sometimes forego positive
Yeah.
freedom,
Yeah.
positive freedom, but the word forego kind of implies that they have had it before. That's the right
Yes.
understanding of the word. But in the case of China, most people who are living in China today have never had positive freedom ever in their life.
Yeah.
So how it's not that they don't even know what it is or they have never exercised it before. So this point, the premise of indivisibility, does it apply in that case?
Yes. I think it's very acute of you to point out the problem with the word forego. I think that's absolutely on target. And when I do this again, if I do this again, that word is out. Thanks to you. Yes, I think there's no doubt that if your proximate political experience is Mao's China, and then the Cultural Revolution, which is the proximate political experience of Xi Jinping, for example, and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, and possibly your parents. You didn't forego democratic freedoms because you never had them. But I think I meant forego in a slightly different sense. You're here in the United States. You live in a society that has some degree of public freedom. And when you go home, one of the decisions that you have to make is how happy you are to forego such public freedom as you have had here. I don't want to overdo this because my point is I want to emphasize just how much your generation of Chinese citizens, how much freedom you do enjoy, right? But the freedom to vote them in and vote them out, you do not have and will not have. But your generation, because of your foreign travel, will have the issue about, are you foregoing a freedom that's not in your experience, but is in the comparative experience of the countries in which you are educated? So that's just an issue. And I certainly can't make that choice for you. But I think it's an issue for you.
Yes, I know there's a big number of Chinese people who have traveled abroad, but that compared to the entire population of China
It's tiny.
is tiny. So
Yeah.
even though there are people who have experienced positive freedom and are bringing this idea, overall, it's still...
Yeah. That point about the tiny number of educated or people who get to travel, I mean, it's not a totally tiny number because, as we were saying before the evening began, one of the interesting facts to me is that last year there were 275,000 Chinese students studying in the United States alone, not including the people studying in Australia and Britain and India, all kinds of places. So there's a very large number of people of your generation who are going out there. Now, again, it's a drop in the bucket against 1.3 billion people. But one of the things you might think about is the historical analogy with the Russians who went overseas in the 19th century, in Tsarist authoritarian times. They were a tiny population in Russia, but they were the returning Russians who blew the country up. I'm not urging you to blow your country up. It's a great country, but I'm just saying, my point is that very small numbers of people can have a leverage effect out of all proportion to their numbers in a population. And don't underestimate your capacity to change your society. There are a lot of you, and a lot of people be watching, see what you do. Back row? Yeah.
Okay, let's see if I can put this right. I have a question about foregoing in our normatively indivisible but practically divisible society here. I think I got that right, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you saw that there was it was an op-ed in the New York Times recently that as our income inequality is growing, our happiness is not going down. In other words, the people who are actually, it was just last week in the New York Times, the people who are actually now much lower in terms of their relationship to the top part that's just off the charts, are not getting unhappier. So what I'm talking about is foregoing equality for material happiness, because the argument that this New York Times piece was making is essentially that as long as people can get their flat screens, I mean, I'm being, but as long as people can get their flat screens and get cheap goods that are coming, a lot of them from China, that they are in fact not getting, you would think they would be getting unhappy about the divisibility.
But they're not.
But they're not. So I wondered if you comment on how do you think that's going to go? How is that trend line? Do you think it is going to separate, or do you think we're going to continue to have this kind of willingness to forego equality as long as we've got material goods, cheap material goods, Walmart?
Yeah. I think, first of all, that inequality is a explosive political issue, and we know this from the political history of the 20th century in the United States, is an explosive political issue when it's accompanied by discrimination, exclusion, and absolute deprivation. There's simply no question that the Homestead strike in the 1890s burst into real violence, real class warfare of a direct kind in Pittsburgh, because those steelworkers had an awful time. It was awful, dirty, dangerous, fatal work, and they felt fury, moral fury at the way they were treated. Relative deprivation, on the back of labor laws, on the back of some kind of social safety net, I think is a very different political phenomenon, which I think we're picking up here, which is that these weird distributions in which, enormous amounts of the income gains of the last 10 years have gone to 1% of the population, I think are much more ambiguous to people politically, because they're not rooted in absolute deprivation, they're not rooted in absolute injustice, and they can be made to appear, and certainly are for lots of people, natural results of skill and entrepreneurial success and luck and stuff that just codes as politically neutral. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. And almost all Americans have a high tolerance for inequality as long as it's earned, so it just disappears as a political issue. And the happiness thing is also interesting. That is, what do I care if I'm flying coach and some of my classmates are flying private jets? I mean, I don't care much. It's kind of indifferent to me. I want coach to be a little better, a little more legroom, but the fact that someone's flying private jet is kind of doesn't register as a political problem, is my point. And the technology point I think you make is really important and hasn't been stressed enough, which is when you have a society in which the janitor and the tenured professor are both working on the same iPhone 6, you're in a different kind of world. And I do not mean to be condescending to the janitor, but it just means that they're in a common digital space in some weird way. And so these new technologies, as the unit cost of these technologies has plummeted in the last 25 years, and we've all experienced it, you have growing income inequality, but the market is generating a steady state common set of equally distributed iPhone 6s or cheap knockoff versions of same. And so the multi-billionaire whips out his fancy phone, and the janitor whips out a phone that has the computing power to put a person on the moon, right? And it has this weird psychically equalizing effect, I think, or it takes the sting from some of the facts of the income distribution. And I just don't, where I feel there is a huge political issue is not, I mean, and I think, you know, liberal, progressive Democrats have got this wrong. What has to be said is basically, and this would be a kind of conservative view, and many of you would disagree, is basically it's not the government's job to determine income distributions in a society. It's the job of a government to make sure that everybody has granite under their feet, that nobody goes through the drain, right? That nobody is miserably poor, nobody is excluded. So opportunity matters hugely, and government can do something about that. But the distribution of income is a subject over which government has limited effect. I mean, let's be more precise, there is no question that after-tax income distributions look very different than pre-tax. And so a good government has a progressive income tax. A good government has a redistributive function within some limits that are then politically discussed. The thing that a government really ought to do something about, and here's where the issue that I brought up in the talk comes alive, is to prevent the unjust use of money by the rich to skew and gain political outcomes. It's the impact of inequality on democracy that seems to me the really salient political issue. Instead of worrying about the fact that there are a lot more billionaires around than there used to be and our income distribution is much more unequal, what you really want to care about is to protect the democratic system from the abuse of big money. And that's where the Supreme Court's surrender has been so really catastrophic. Because it's not, and it's more than a surrender, it's the active moral and legal validation of this that is so scandalous, by calling money speech and giving money the protections of a great constitutional tradition. This is really outrageous in my view. And that can be fixed, that can be stopped, and that should be stopped. Because without a political system that appears to be an equal playing field, an equally open wall, these systems can tip very, very fast. I think liberal democracy is very fragile. And if the political system is compromised, as it is now, then you have an inequality issue that I care about, I see, and I want to stop right away. And we're getting nowhere with it. It's the constitutional entrenchment of this money power that seems to me unprecedented, extremely dangerous, and that's where I think you want to focus on your concern about inequality. I'm sorry to have gone on at 10-minute length and answer your question, but it's so important.
Barbara, can we I just want to open it up. Everybody gets treated that way. Sure. Thanks.
Sure. You spoke so eloquently and passionately in the final part of your talk. What I heard, and I may have misheard, being evoked by your tone was your intense perception that America, that the United States, is moving toward, may already be, an authoritarian capitalist regime. Some of the phrases that you used expressing your concern about the United States, well, you said about Putin's Russia, elections are not on a level playing field, the point you just made about the United States.
Yeah.
Turkey and Hungary, the system is gerrymandered. Wealthy people want to use their power politically. You didn't say what I think that your passion may have been expressing, that the country of the United States is moving in this direction, and yes, we can summon up all manner of reforms, but the more it moves along that path, the more difficult it is to imagine these reforms ever being enacted.
Yeah. That's a very good challenge to what I'm saying. And so I'm thinking, why am I not saying what you think I'm saying? That is, why am I not saying that America has become an authoritarian capitalist society, certainly a capitalist society? I think I'm saying that not because I think money power is absolutely out of control. The constitutional, the congressional system has been gerrymandered in a way that it should shock Americans that 90% of congressional seats are non-competitive. In other words, there are free elections, competitive elections, in only 10% of the congressional races, right? A, because of gerrymandering, and B, because of incumbent advantage. And this is a game played by both parties. I'm an equal opportunity abuser here. I'm not, the Democrats are as bad as the Republicans. But it means that of 435 seats, only 10% of them are competitive in any American congressional election. Well, that's very alarming. And the Citizens United stuff seems to me to usher in an era of a kind of oligarchical control of the political system by, we've got a Republican set of primaries in which the crucial determinants of who wins will not be the voters of the United States or Republican, but about 6 multi-billionaires who will decide which of these people they want to have run. Well, there's clearly something badly wrong, and it's worse than it was in the 1880s and 90s. There's something really bad here. What why I feel it's not an authoritarian system is that the institutions of divided government, the Madisonian machinery, is still working. It's not an authoritarian system because the constitutional architecture has not yet been gerrymandered out of existence. You do have an independent Supreme Court of enormous institutional prestige. You may not like their political allegiances, but their independence is beyond question, it seems to me. You do have a free press. Again, that's an upside of the First Amendment that I was just criticizing. You do have, the other original Madisonian point is that you've got the continental democracy is so large that the capacity of one oligarchy to dominate the whole country is still beyond reach. Madison's original insight that you want a union, a continental or a union of 13, there will be factions here, factions there, by which he meant business interests, elites that seek to dominate and gerrymander the system. But the number of elites, the number of oligarchies here is so large that no one oligarch has yet been able to reduce this to subvert democracy itself. But look, it's the fever signs that I picked up in my talk and that we're all thinking about, a presidential election in 2016 in which we have essentially a dynastic political contest, is very troubling to Americans. Because it says, you can't run a political order in which you say to every damn school child in this country, when you grow up, you can be president of the United States, if the only people who get to be president are the descendants of presidents. You can't the discordance between what you're saying to the kids and what's happening is becoming very loud. And what I hope is that you don't have an authoritarian system when that discordance becomes very loud. This country, I guess what I'm saying is never underestimate the strength of the original Madisonian architecture, the fact that it hasn't been totally compromised, and the sense that the factions are too widespread for one oligarchy to dominate. And finally, there is rising anger among ordinary American citizens about this. This is becoming systemic. This isn't just one election cycle, but every one that anybody can remember seems to be just basically not working the way it should. And the final minor point, which again I don't think Americans will pay much attention to, is that there really are ways and examples, living examples in other democratic systems, which have fixed these problems. That is, none of these problems can't be fixed. They really can be fixed. There are institutional fixes for every single problem we've discussed, in my view. And so get on with it. Get it done.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Sir, back
Well, how about a student? Well, why would a student? No, Lucas.
See, there seem to be two lines that you're talking about, the tendency towards apathy and the tendency towards anger and wanting to change.
Yeah.
Maybe not the system, but I see in my generation a lot of apathy where we see this dynastic phenomenon and we just be like, well, we can't really change it, we don't really, why vote if my vote isn't going to do anything? So do you see an inevitability towards either of those directions? Do you think that my generation, how do we motivate my generation to do more in the political sphere? Yeah.
Question.
Go ahead.
Is that phenomenon that Yanka is describing, is that necessarily a bad thing?
apathy, disengagement.
Yeah. In a very broad context.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't want to have an election and have nobody show up.
Okay.
I mean, it seems that would be a bad thing. But I think your question implies something else. Apathy can be a very bad thing if it's accompanied by cynical disengagement and disillusion. But there is a kind of apathy that takes the form of anger. This isn't worth my time. I'm not, and I think it's appropriate for your generation always to be asking, is it worth turning out this time? Show me a reason why I should turn out. And I think your generation, interestingly, does not appear to have a sense that my generation had, and my generation may be the last to have it, that said it's a kind of civic duty. That is, irrespective of how stupid, venial, boring the politicians are, I got to show up, right? There's some weird way in which the civic duty was entirely disconnected with, right? And I think, so I'm trying to find something positive. The positive thing is that that sense of civic duty, irrespective of what you actually thought about the political system, has collapsed. Now you're asking every time you're faced with electoral choice, is it worth my time? And that, in some sense, might be it puts a demand on the political system to speak to you. And there are a few moments when I've been kind of amazed at the response of young people to political campaigns that grab them by the lapels. The Obama campaign is one obvious example in 2008, but even Rand Paul, whose politics I don't agree with, is getting up close and saying, tell me what you want, I am listening. And I think, again, I disagree with him, but that seems to me what you're going to have to do. You're much more demanding consumers of political argument than in some ways a tradition raised on civic duty ever was. So maybe I'm trying to find something positive and happy. But the end of the message is get out and vote. Is that clear? Because the other thing that politicians do is we indulge the young. We find excuses for you. No damn excuses. Line up and vote.
Yeah, yes.
Because the other reality, I mean, this is the final end of my sermon. I've been to so many countries who've either lost their democracy or just recovered their democracy or had to fight to get their democracy. Apathy is the privilege of people who can count on the stability of their society. Just go to a society which has lost its democracy or just recovered it or had to fight for it, and you begin to realize why this thing matters. I just really don't let, if apathy is a signal to the elite, you're ignoring us and not speaking to us, okay. But if it's an apathy that says, what do I need politics for? Everything's fabulous. Look out, because it'll be taken away from you. And I'm not implying that's what you're saying.
It's so important, you know. During the French Revolution, there was women who were beheaded. You have to say, you know, we can be beheaded, we have the right to speak. And it was on the Rouge, and there were so many women who died. And can I think in France, the right for women to vote was 1946 by General de Gaulle after the World War II. You know? So, and I remember when I was for a time I went to vote, I went with my grandfather, and he told us, you know, people died to get that right to vote. They knew it's an historical thing. I think it's in France, I don't know, it's just like we are part of history. And we have not to just give up some rights that some people died for.
For us, it feels like a memory. We don't really, it feels so there's so much distance between us and all the fighting.
But just, I think you just,
forget.
I think it's just like thinking you are just making the game of those people who want people to become like that. But you have to see that you have the right to speak, to stand up for what you say, and maybe one vote to change something.
Actually, I mean, you just said that, and that's really inspiring, and that reminded me that, so positive, negative physics, right? And this actually happened in a Wellesley election. We just had our elections, and I voted. And the options were vote for the candidate, write in, abstain, or say that you don't want to vote. And abstain was different than don't want to vote. So with the right to vote comes the right to refuse to vote. And actually when I said is apathy necessarily a bad thing, I was asking, is it necessarily a bad thing that my generation is signaling to your generation that something is wrong?
Say that again? That was good. I just didn't understand it. Just the last bit.
Is it necessarily a bad thing that my generation is signaling to your generation that something is wrong?
Yes. No. I'm saying it's a very good thing that your generation is sending that signal. Absolutely. On that, we're agreed. And I was in elected office. I ran, I ran in 3 national elections in that little country up north. Won 2, lost the 3rd. And the other thing that needs to be said about politics is, yes, voter participation by your generation is lower than it was in my generation. Sometimes it's because you're sending me exactly that signal. But it's also the case, if you look at any major campaign in any liberal democracy anywhere in the world, Hillary's campaign, any campaign you look at, my campaign, who staffed it? Your generation. I do want to acknowledge that, otherwise it just seems like...
It's like the 2 ends of the spectrum. That's
You were the guys who made it happen. I wouldn't have had a political career had it not been for your generation, just slightly older. So I don't want to end on anything other than a positive note, and thank you for
Thank you. Thanks very much.